10 years ago, I studied abroad. I had a few friends in this new country and was glad to find a place to live with some cool people my age. I started hanging out with this crew, which became my friends, and we used to smoke a lot of weed. Things were going well. There was this one friend of my roommates, Frank, who came over to our place from time to time. I thought it was odd because he was like twice everybody's age. He was very intense as a person and made me feel slightly uncomfortable the first time I met him. He seemed extremely suspicious of me and would ask me all kinds of questions to figure me out. But he had a good sense of humor and would always crack great jokes. In a way, he was kind of charming, and my roommates seemed to love him. Also, he always brought pizza. I asked one of my friends what the deal was with this guy, and he said, "Oh, you don't know? Last year, he found his wife and her brothers murdered in their flat. He is under investigation, but he didn't do it." I was taken aback by this. How could they know he didn't do it? And why did they want to hang around with a potential psycho? I gave it the benefit of the doubt, but I certainly saw Frank in a new light. Time went on, and Frank came by our place almost daily. He was very clever and slyly manipulative. I got to know more about his background. He used to be in a gang when he was my age. He had been in prison most of the time between then and now for violence. This did not help me trust him. I couldn't believe how naive my roommates were to trust this man. Then the police went out and declared him a suspect. By now, this had become the biggest investigation ever in that particular area. He was interrogated, but released due to lack of evidence. Back home at our place, he would sit and talk about how he was a victim of a conspiracy, and all my friends would nod and believe him. I felt crazy being the only one who didn't believe it. He must have sensed it because he took me outside and asked me if I believed him. I said, yeah, sure I did, because by now I was starting to get afraid of him. I asked him about the murders, and he told me his version of the event where he, according to him, found the bodies. It was gruesome, but I still had doubts. To my horror, he would crack jokes about the whole thing at another time. Who in their right mind would joke about that? In my mind, only a complete psychopath. I started researching what a psychopath is and learned that this guy fits every classical definition. I freaked out because I couldn't figure out what he wanted from us. I started getting paranoid, believing that he planned on killing me and my roommates. I couldn't tell this to my roommates because they were fully blinded by this guy's charades and trusted him. At one point, I started sleeping with a knife in my bed. That's how scared I was that he was going to come and murder us like he murdered those poor souls. This was a horrible time for me. On top of that, the police had been tipped off about the relatively large amounts of weed being kept in the house and started raiding the place. 2 of my roommates were busted, and this marked the breakup of our group. The day I moved out, Frank helped me with my stuff and looked at me menacingly. "You're all right," he said. "I planned on killing you, but you're all right." "I kid you not," he told me this. The others laughed it off as a joke, but I saw it very differently. I was very glad to leave after hanging out with this murderer on and off for almost 2 years. Frank would be arrested shortly later, starting a huge trial that lasted several years. I found some new friends and found my way back to some normality in my life. That's when I realized how messed up the whole situation was. I had been isolated with all this and had no one else to turn to. A year later, I was back in my home country and followed the trial. All the craziness that surfaced about this man during the trial convinced me that I was probably right all along. He was mentally unstable and was convicted to 4 life sentences. He will never be a free man again. My boyfriend recently moved to the city and rented a room in a student building. To explain, the building had 3 different levels, and each level contained 4 individual rooms with separate locks. Each room was akin to a separate rental unit, sharing common amenities like a shower, toilet, and kitchen. Overall, it felt more like having your apartment than a house. He resided on the 3rd floor. Recently, we purchased a cabinet for his room. As we were moving the cabinet through the front door, another person entered the building alongside us. Politely, we let him pass, understanding that moving the heavy cabinet upstairs would take considerable time. I smiled and greeted him, but upon seeing his face, my instincts signaled danger. He had a peculiar, almost unsettling, satisfied smile, towering over me. His sparse, adolescent-like mustache and greasy hair made him appear unkempt and dirty. He ascended to the 2nd floor, and though my boyfriend and I tried not to dwell on it, we couldn't shake off the unsettling feeling he left us with. About a week later, while walking a friend's dog in the evening, we encountered the same man. It was still bright outside, but his peculiar slow-motion gait and the familiar smug smile set off alarm bells. Observing his face, it became apparent that he was not sober. His appearance suggested he was under the influence of drugs. His unsettling demeanor and altered state made me feel extremely uncomfortable. I wanted to keep my distance and avoid any interaction. This incident occurred near the city center. Deciding not to walk back to the building alongside him, my boyfriend and I took an alternate route, ensuring he had returned to his room before we entered the building. However, what made this encounter truly creepy was some background information. 3 weeks prior, there had been a murder near the school campus where a jogger was fatally stabbed. The suspect, who had been spotted around the campus at that time, was described in a release sketch, although the authorities had no substantial leads. Today, upon returning from my boyfriend's work at around 4 p.m., we noticed a man in a suit standing outside. Initially, we didn't think much of it. Later in the night, our neighbor from next door approached me as I returned from the bathroom. He inquired if we had a key to the front door. Confirming that we did, he revealed that the police had to break down the door and that they were issuing new keys to everyone. Joined by my boyfriend and another neighbor, I asked about the incident. Shockingly, the neighbor disclosed that the individual who murdered the campus lived on the 2nd floor of our building. Chills ran down my spine as I learned that the description matched the creepy individual we had encountered earlier. Tall, black hair, a strange mustache, and an unkempt appearance. It was the same person who had cooked meals in the shared kitchen while being responsible for taking someone's life. I had smiled at him, greeted him, and actively tried to avoid him without realizing the imminent danger he posed. My boyfriend and I were still in shock, having lived near a murderer who had roamed around the city center, completely unaware of the threat that lingered next door. I had just moved to my new college town and didn't even have a cell phone yet after leaving the one my folks paid for during undergrad behind. I felt grown and capable of taking care of myself. I was out shopping for school supplies and things for my new apartment one evening during my first week of grad school. As I left the parking lot with my purchases, I noticed a truck pull up behind me at the exit. It was late, and there weren't too many people around. I pulled out onto a long retail street with lots of stoplights, and I realized the guy in the truck was trying to get my attention. Despite being in a relationship, I ignored him. Over the next few miles, he persisted in trying to get me to look at him. At red lights, he would end up ahead of me, or behind or beside me. At every stop, he positioned himself to stare at me directly or through his mirrors. His intense gaze made my anxiety rise. He drove oddly, speeding up close to my bumper, hitting his brakes when in front of me, and swerving close to my car a couple of times. Finally, at a red light where he was beside me, I glanced over and started to panic. I was met with an unbelievably empty, unwavering stare and realized he was behaving inappropriately. He was getting pleasure from the fact that I was terrified, and he was following me, attempting to force me to pull over. At one point, I quickly maneuvered through an intersection on a hard yellow, a couple of cars ahead of him, hoping to shake him off. But it didn't work. He went around the cars at the light, ran the red, and got back in front of me. As a freeway entrance ramp approached, I tried to trick him by putting on my signal and getting into the merge lane. He took the bait and started up the ramp. I swiftly got out of the merge lane and continued straight. I hoped to lose him, but he drove his truck down the embankment to keep following. At another light, where he was beside me, I pulled through the light and then turned at the last possible second. He made a U-turn and ran another red light to follow me. My panic skyrocketed at that point. With no cell phone and no sense of direction in a new city, I didn't know what to do. So, I turned on some classic rock and forced myself to sing along, going the speed limit to maintain control. I decided to drive to the supermarket across town because I remembered it had a police station in it. He followed me all the way there, but sped out of the lot as soon as he saw all the police cruisers parked out front. I filed a report and asked for a police escort home because something told me this person was waiting for me to leave the police station. Indeed, as soon as I pulled out, I saw him. I pulled over and told the officer following me. But the truck had already taken off, and the cop couldn't catch him. The police obtained surveillance video from the store, revealing that this person had been following me the entire time I was shopping. They saw him following me through the store, lurking close enough to grab my elbow and circling the lot in his truck, waiting for me to leave. My heart sank when I realized that I could only recall 6 or 7 digits of his plate and the make and model of his truck. In the end, the police said there was little they could do. The surveillance footage didn't show him doing anything particularly illegal, making it a challenging case to charge him with anything. To feel safer, I ended up trading vehicles with a friend for a couple of months and tried to move on with my life. It wasn't until almost 15 years later that I learned what he had done. I was watching a Discovery ID show about the kidnapping and murder of Sandy Jeffers, and I nearly fell out of my seat when I saw the mugshot of her killer, Aaron Lee Skeen. It was him. I was deeply disgusted that law enforcement had done nothing in my case. I tracked down the investigator in the murder case and provided an official statement after verifying some details about the vehicle. She couldn't confirm or deny that my encounter was with Skeen, but she did mention that he was serving life without parole. I wish something could have been done when he terrorized me. Perhaps things would have been different for Sandy.